The story of Rome is fascinating, and it also is a story that has a lot of different interpretations. So it's been useful, actually, and very interesting for me to hear some of you who've written in the discussion forum take your own position on some of the things that I talked about, or actually do the readings that I recommended, and see that there are other ways of reading these things, whether it's how we read the Campidoglio or Bernini's projects for St. Peter's. And that's wonderful and rich and useful because in many ways we do have to interpret what we see in Rome. We don't really have a guidebook written by the people who made it that tell us explicitly what we're supposed to see and perceive. A lot of what we perceive in Rome depends on our capacity to perceive it and the amount of research we do, but also our personal points of view or predilections. I'm coming at Rome from the point of view of an architect. I'm actually a practicing architect as much as a professor of architecture, and I teach history and theory. And so I'm interested in Rome for what it actually can tell us about today, what we might actually learn from Rome. Because for me, the past is alive. It has things to tell us, things to teach us. And so I'm interested in Rome for what it can tell us about what we can do with cities today. I mean, it's wonderful to know about Rome, and I think our experience of Rome is richer when we research it. But the reason people came to Rome for so many centuries was really to learn how to make cities in their own world, in their world that they were going to return to, in their modern world. And I think that's still true today. I think the fact that Rome is so beautiful is something that should hopefully make us think a little bit about what more we could expect from our cities. For me, that beauty of Rome, though, is a means, it's not an end. I don't think Rome was made beautiful just to be beautiful. I think the reason for the beauty was that it was a kind of a doorway that would essentially invite us in and allow us to perceive the messages that Rome was trying to convey. Now, as we learned in talking about the Pozzesso route and the city as theater, some of those messages were reinforced in an ephemeral way by temporary constructions. So things that were erected essentially, let's say, for a temporary procession like the Pozzesso route. And in this wonderful book by Frederick Hammond called Music and Spectacle in Baroque Rome, it's a book about music in Rome, but also about the ceremonies and events that were also embellished and enriched by music. And one of the things Hammond describes is the Pozzesso route of Pope Urban VIII, Maffeo Barberini, who was really Bernini's first great papal patron. And for the Pozzesso route, that in that case, because of Michelangelo's project, was actually able to ascend the Campidoglio, they set up a series of temporary statues, basically made of plaster, on the Cordonata, the ramp step that leads up to the Campidoglio. And starting from the bottom, there were groups of essentially pairs, 5 pairs of sculpture that were meant to represent what this pope was going to bring to his papacy and to the city of Rome. So the first pair was sacred poetry and eloquence. So he was a poet. He was actually a humanist scholar and a poet. He was going to bring legal studies and theology. These are, again, his attributes, his background, and his formation. Gentilezza, so gentility, but a kind of civility, and also fortune. He thought of himself as a lucky pope and a lucky person. He was going to bring abundance and public happiness. So all of these good things about him were going to essentially redound to the happiness of Rome and Romans. And finally, fame and glory. So just as he was about to make it up onto the piazza, he's essentially saying all of this is going to lead to fame and glory. His own, but hopefully that of Rome as well. When the procession arrived at the piazza, immediately at the top of the Cordonata, and therefore before the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, they erected a triumphal arch. And it had 2 faces. So like we talked about in the chorus, the piazza faces in 2 different directions. Towards the city of Rome, and therefore towards basically St. Peter's and the papacy, the allegories and the imagery had to do with the ecclesiastical role and power of the Pope. On the other side, towards the Palazzo Senatorio, towards the Forum, and towards ancient Rome, the allegories had to do with civic virtues. At the very top was an image of Rome itself, and Roman heroes or virtuous Romans from the past. So we see that these ideas about Rome sometimes are made permanent, sometimes are built into essentially hardwired into the constructions that are made in Rome. Sometimes, though, they were ephemeral, temporary. They came and went. They were up for a little while and they disappeared. And they survived in people's imaginations. Hammett has an argument that in fact that ceremonial procession and that temporary construction probably influenced a great ceiling fresco in the Palazzo Barberini, so the papal, essentially family palace, had a great ceiling fresco of essentially the virtues and allegory of the Barberini family. And a lot of those same devices that show up at the foot of the Campidoglio show up on the ceiling of the Palazzo Barberini. So as we've suggested in the course, a lot of these ideas essentially reverberate back. Sometimes they're shaped by the city, and sometimes they go back and they actually shape the city. They actually have an influence on the permanent construction.